Welcome to Pilates is the Answer podcast, where you can discover the power of Pilates and how it can improve every aspect of your life. We are your hosts, Stacey Jernigan
and Pearl Dahmen, and we look forward to introducing and sharing all of the questions about which Pilates is the answer.
Welcome back, Pilates is the Answer family.
Yay. We're in Stacey's studio today. Sage is joining us as usual. And today we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to continue on talking about the spine.
Yes, some of the lumbar spine.
Right. Well, and we kind of chatted a little bit beforehand, but really the whole thing for me is that really trying to understand the difference between neutral and imprint. And what I have seemed to find, even for myself, teaching for a long time, and when I speak with other instructors, new and not so new, is there is a lot of confusion around neutral and imprint. Not exactly what it is, but when to use it and why it's important. And, you know, Stacey is our resident master trainer. So I'm going to let her share her perspective on that. And if I have 2 cents, I may add it later.
Okay, that sounds good. So I feel like I probably left my training years ago having a technical knowledge of the difference between imprint and neutral. Like I passed my test, I did well explaining it, but could I find it in my own body? And could I see it in a client's body? Probably not. You know, like it was still kind of vague to me. What I find in teaching just in general is that it is difficult for people to understand, how to find the difference between those two, because I think sometimes instructors will teach it in a way that makes you think that what you have to do when you're finding an imprinted position is that you have to force your low back down, right? Yes. And I've been in classes where the instructor has said, flatten your low back to the mat, or flatten your low back to the carriage on the reformer. So, let me back up a little bit. I'll come back to that in a second. But in general, basically, what we're talking about, especially if you're not an instructor or you're new to Pilates, or you just haven't maybe even heard these terms before, or you're confused yourself. Just in general, your neutral spine and your natural spine are the curves that you have when you're standing up with good posture, right?
Right.
So we have our cervical spine curve, and then we have our lumbar spine curve, and those kind of mirror each other. And then your thoracic curves the opposite way, basically.
Right. And that's for people that don't have any kind of anything going on in their back. So like scoliosis is going to be an issue from that. If there's been a back injury, there's going to be an issue.
If you have a significant sway back, right, where you really arch your low back and kind of poke your butt out a little bit, right? So those types of things. If you think about it when you're laying down, if you are just thinking about the skeleton, and we don't have, like the rest of our body parts, like our belly and our booty and those types of things getting in the way. If you just think about your skeleton, if the pelvis and the hip bones, the ASIS points, right, your hip bones in the front of the pelvis, if those are level with each other, those are level with your pubic bone. And so basically when you're laying down, they're pointed directly up towards the ceiling. That's kind of your neutral, and your low back is hovering off the carriage or off the mat. I like to oftentimes describe it as, imagine there's a blueberry under your low back, and you've got on a beautiful white shirt, and you don't want that blueberry to touch your low back. So you are actually using your core muscles to draw your low back up away from the surface you're laying on, as opposed to laying there cozy slouched. Then when you go to find an imprint, you tilt your hip bones, those ASIS points, up towards your chest. And as a result of that pelvic tilt, your low back lengthens, your lumbar spine curvature lengthens out. It doesn't mean that it goes flat. So going back to my point earlier, what was confusing for me is I've got a big booty. I've got some cushion back there, right? And so whenever an instructor would say they wouldn't say force, but they would say flatten your low back. And I would find myself forcing my back down, and then my shoulders would round, and then my neck would feel scrunched up. I mean, it didn't feel right. And So I think sometimes the way that can help people visualize a clock on their belly. And if you just had a clock, like literally laying there and you're laying flat, all the points of the clock, if the 6 was down at your pubic bone, right, that lowest part of your pelvis, and then your 12 o'clock of the clock is up above your belly button. The 6 and the 12 are level with each other. And then the 3 and the 9, those are your hip bones, these points in the front. And the 3 and the 9 are level with each other. All the points of the clock, including the middle of the clock, are all level with each other. And that would not include your belly poking out. You don't have a belly, but I do. But so not including that, but I'm saying anatomically thinking about the skeleton, the bones, right? Okay. All of those are kind of level. So then when you think about your imprint, you're tilting your 6 up towards your 12. Okay. That's just a simple way. Now there's a lot other complicated things involving the ribs and, all that. But basically engaging that lowest part of your core, when we talk about the transversus abdominis, right? And all that seat belt, the lower type muscles, engage those to literally hold your low back in that lifted hovering position away from the blueberry, and or your transversus should also be working to tilt the pelvis if you're coming into the imprint. Okay.
Okay. So from an instructor's point of view, how can you tell if a person really is in the proper neutral spine? I mean, it's, some people do have that nice round, Kardashian back end. And then some of them more like me where, it's pancake flat, and there is none. So from a instructor perspective, what would you look for to be able to tell, are they really a neutral spine or are they out of it?
So I like for there to be a lot of tactile support, both coming from the instructor and the client, where the client can learn to find it in their own body as well. And because if somebody has on a baggy shirt, or if they do have a sway back and, their booty is kind of melted down into the carriage, you can't tell, you can't really see. So teaching them to do it themselves, I think, is really important. And also incorporating in, like we mentioned earlier, if there's any dysfunction going on in the spine, and then also, how does it feel? That's what I want to ask whoever I'm teaching, is when you're laying down on your back, for example, and your legs are bent and your feet are, flat on the mat. First, just lay there, right? And think about, how do you feel? How does your back feel? How does your neck feel? And then just kind of maybe wiggle your hips a little bit. If you got to get your booty out of the way a little bit, those of us that have to worry about that, then find a position that feels good, where you feel that you are, comfy-ish. We don't want to get cozy, but where you feel like, okay, I'm not feeling any pain. I'm not smushing my low back. And just practice a couple of tilts back and forth of the hips, thinking about that clock image. Tilt the hip bones up towards the 12 o'clock, right? Up towards the chest area, basically. And then tilt them away and just learn what the difference is between when the lumbar spine is lengthening out and decompressing and imprinting versus when are you hyperextending it, which we don't want to do. But if you are teaching somebody and they're supported and they're, flat on their back on a mat, and you're just helping them try to find that gentle move back and forth. It's very small. Like I'm going to say half an inch, honestly. Really small move. And then settle into the neutral position that's between those two, where, the 6, the 12, the 3, and the 9 are level with each other. I like to have people bring their heels of their hands to their hip bones and then their fingertips together over the pubic bone, where you're making like a triangle. And I just have them notice when you tilt into your imprint, when your 6 comes to 12, what happens to the fingertips? They lift higher than the heels of the hands. When you go away, which for most of us, especially those of us with disc issues in the low back or even just pain in the low back, you don't really need to go into the tilt where the 12 comes above the 6, and then find that middle position between the two of them. The other thing that's really important is, what are the ribs doing? So this is where I think it can get kind of complicated for people, but the bottom of the ribs, what is the space that is between the bottom of the ribs and the top of the hips? And the way I have them do it is take their thumbs and place them at the very bottom of the ribs, and then place your middle fingers on your hip bones. And then when you're adding that pelvic tilt, after you've learned what it is, right, after you've learned the tilt position, when you find your neutral, your natural position, what is that space that's between the ribs and the hips, okay? And then when you go into your imprint and tilt the pelvis upward towards the chest, notice that amount shortens, that space shortens, right? Then the tricky part is once you find which one works best for your body, how do you stay in that position while you're doing all of the Pilates moves, right?
Keep your abs in, right?
Yeah, you keep those abdominal muscles really, really contracted and really tight, and you use the breath to do it. And I think slow movements and thinking about what we're doing. So is my core tight before I go to pick up my leg, as opposed to just pick my leg up in the air?
Yeah, always is. What's the core doing before you start? That makes sense. I have another question for you when it comes to imprinted and neutral spine. And actually, I have been teaching for quite a while, and I do really know the difference. And in my early training, it was like neutral spine, neutral spine. There was only like a couple rare situations where you imprint spine. And now as I've started to learn more, sometimes I hear you should be imprinting things. Sometimes I hear you should be only in neutral, and it's become very confusing. And I feel like a lot of instructors feel that way about imprinted versus neutral. So maybe you can clarify that, because I feel like it is really something that I know I struggle with knowing when I should cue it and when I shouldn't, and how I should cue it and shouldn't, because I feel like, because I do teach classes, some people in the class should be imprinting and some people should be in neutral. So how do you tell the whole class something like that without them being confused?
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. I think part of the reason why it's a confusing concept is because some instructors have been classically trained and some have been contemporarily trained, right? My training's contemporary. So, you know, I interviewed one of my mentors several podcasts ago, Julie Turner, and that was a contemporary program. I lead trainings for Club Pilates. That's a contemporary program. But then there's also classical programs out there. As I best understand it, many of the exercises that are like in a manual of a training program, for example, are described in as if you would be teaching a private, you would be teaching a person one-on-one, okay? Whereas now there are so many, which is what I really love to do. I love privates, but I do teach classes also. And so you have to think of it from a safety standpoint, you know, and for me anyway, you know, I know with my background of teaching in a very small setting and then going into teaching in a Club Pilates setting where there's 12 versus my training, I was used to teaching 2 or 3 at the most. You have to think of what is safest for the group and how to get them there. I hate to say it this way, but how do you get them there the fastest, right? So that you don't have somebody in your class bored waiting for you to explain to people who might need to be in a different position. You know, you have to kind of get them all moving. So as I understand it, the safest way when you're in open kinetic chain is being in an imprint versus in closed kinetic chain, you're in a neutral spine, right?
Real quick, so, just in case our listeners don't know the difference between open and closed.
Right,
share that.
So open kinetic chain is when the weight of your legs is not supported. Okay, so the way that you and I are both sitting here, we have one foot on the ground, we have the other leg resting on the surface that we're sitting. I'm in a nice comfy chair, Pearl sitting on my reformer. But the weight of our legs is supported. Gravity has, you know, won, and our legs are down. Whereas if we had our legs floating in the air, that's an open kinetic chain. So it can compromise the spine if you're in open kinetic chain and you're not holding a neutral spine by using your core, right? So what can happen is that a lot of times when we go to pick our leg up in the air quickly to get into an exercise or to get or even outside of Pilates to get up and down
tabletop when you're on the reformer. That's
like example. A tabletop. Yeah. Exactly. And when you go to pick up your leg, no matter what you're doing, whether you're going to go to tabletop, whether you're going to go put your foot in the foot strap, whether you're going to get up out of a chair and go to stand up. We don't think about, is my core engaged? What is my spine doing? Am I safely lifting my leg? And so then you can use your hip flexor and to do all of the work, or you can use your back, right? And our bodies are very kind of lazy, as I've mentioned a few times, but they're also very smart. And the body is going to utilize its fight or flight receptors, like the hip flexor, the bodyguard to the spine, the QL, the quadratus laborum. The body's going to go to those first before it's going to let the spine get damaged and have disc issues with the discs. So because sometimes we're moving too quickly, right? If we say in a group setting of 12, legs to tabletop, we're going into our chest lift. Probably it's likely that, I don't know, half the class just threw their legs up in the air and they're let's do this. Let's go. I'm ready. I love this. Versus, are you holding a beautiful imprinted or neutral spine, either one, right? And are you using your core to float your leg up in the air? And then float the other leg up in the air. And then now, what is your pelvis doing? What is your spine doing? Are you still in an imprint, or are you still in a neutral, right? So that's the hard part, is that no, we're not usually moving that slowly. We're not moving that intentionally. We're ready. We want to go through the motions and do it. So that's one part of it. And then the other piece of it is, so the safety standpoint is one part of it. Then the other piece of it is, there is such a high incidence of back issues, right? Some diagnosed, some not. So degenerative discs, very common. Really just disc issues in general, bulging discs, herniated discs, compressed discs, all kinds of things. Then we're also dealing with people that have stenosis of the spine. A lot of times people will come to Pilates because of an incidence of back pain or some other type of, injury or issue. And so again, you have to think from a safety standpoint. Oftentimes, people are going to be more engaged in their core if they're in the imprinted position, and they're lengthening that lumbar. So so thinking about it in terms of not putting that pressure, potentially putting pressure on the discs, would be less likely to occur if you were in an imprinted position where your spine is more lengthened. So that even if you came out of that imprint a little bit and came to neutral, that's going to be way better than if you start in neutral and go to pick up one leg and go into an arch or hyperextension of the back, because then you can compress those discs. So if you already are dealing with some compromised spinal issues, then that can lead to pain.
So from a standpoint of you're teaching a class and it's new people, not people that have built some core up, how would you try to cue that so that new people would imprint and those that might have some experience could not imprint? Or would you just tell the whole class to imprint just to be safe?
Yeah, so my recommendation, and I know that there's going to be people that disagree with me, I'm okay with that. This is just my understanding and my best advice on what, I think is safest. That if you're in a small setting and you're able to, communicate in an individual way, so one, two people, maybe three, right? Where it's not going to disrupt the flow of the session, where you can ask, and you can watch, and you can make sure that they're safe, and you can make sure that they feel okay, and you can ask, are you feeling your back? Or if you're going to know with two or three people, or even just one person, you're going to know more about each of their issues. Whereas in a group class, where you don't have as much time in between the classes, and you might ask at the beginning of class, you're supposed to ask at the beginning of class, are there any injuries? Is there anything going on with your spine or your body? Sometimes people tell us, sometimes people don't. So I think in a large group setting, like at a Club Pilates, for example, where there's 12 people, I think it is always safest and best to have the entire class in an imprinted position when it's open kinetic chain. So that would be anytime the legs are in the air, tabletop, legs at 90, legs at 45, right? Any of those abdominal type exercises. Whereas when the weight of the legs is supported, so when you go to bridge, or when you go to, feet and straps that everybody loves, or those types of things, you might offer the choice. Okay. So what I do a lot of times in footwork, for example, is I'll say, notice how your back feels. We might do a couple of pelvic tilts before we get started. And then I'll say, you pick which one feels the best, while you're feeling your core muscles work, right? If your core muscles are working and you're not feeling your back, I'm great. I love it, right? That's what I want for you. Do I care whether or not you're in neutral or imprint from, not that I don't care, but like from a perspective of, does it matter to me if everyone is in imprint or everyone is in neutral, if we're all in closed kinetic chain and footwork? Nope, I don't care. You pick one, whatever works best for your body, where you're not compromising your spine, where you're using your core, and where you're sticking with it. And those are my exact words. I'll say neutral or imprint, pick one, stick with it, don't let the hips move. We're going into our footwork, Okay. And to me, that's what works best in a group class, because you don't have time to ask 12 people which is best for them. You don't have time to discuss all those contraindications. You wouldn't get many exercises done at all.
No, absolutely. You get a lot of looks like, when are we
Let's
going to start?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But you said, I heard you say pelvic still, right? So we're talking about pelvic stability.
Yes.
Right. So let's talk about that for just a moment in relation to the imprinted and neutral spine.
Yeah. So again, if you're in closed kinetic chain, the weight of the legs is supported. So if it's something like footwork, for example, or feet in straps, where the weight of the legs is supported, so gravity isn't trying to pull the legs down, basically, then that's one of those where I would say pick neutral or imprint, but stick with it. Don't let the hips move, right? And so what you want is true lumbo-pelvic stability. How do I move my legs without moving my hips? Okay. Really, truthfully, most people need to go way smaller than they think they should in things like feet in straps, and way slower than they think they should in things like footwork, right?
Yeah.
Slowing down, using the breath, finding the connection between the breath and the core, and moving from the core and really thinking about what you're doing, because it can be easy to just get excited about the next exercise or get excited about what to move into next, and we don't think about, okay, let me make sure my core is engaged and my hips are not moving while I float my legs up in the air. And then make sure once I bring my legs up in the air that my hips are level, right? And that I'm protecting my spine and that my core is engaged and that my hip flexors aren't taking over or my back isn't taking over.
Well, it's a laundry list of things to think about, and you're not even on the movement yet.
Yes, and I think that's why it's so hard to teach a large group class. It is so challenging. It's a lot to learn. And that's why I think it can be confusing for instructors and confusing for clients as well, because it's so darn much to say, and it's so darn much to think about from both perspectives, as the teacher and as the client. And I don't know, maybe that's part of the reason why I like to teach private.
That would make sense to me. I've mostly done my teaching in groups.
Yeah.
So that's where I find, how should I cue?
Yeah.
What's important? How should I cue? So the whole, cueing, I'm sure you've got don't want to call laundry list, but an extensive list of the best ways to cue, the best ways to start, how to work in a class type of situation.
Yes, that's one of my favorite things to help instructors with, because I think it can be very challenging as an instructor, because again, there's so much to think about. I think it can be challenging to speak to people in a way that they understand what you're saying, where you can say it in a concise, quick way, commanding the movement, commanding the class, getting them moving. Because again, in a private setting, you have a little bit more of the opportunity to chit chat more, and does this make sense? And let me hold your hips in place so that you can feel what I'm talking about. During footwork, let me hold your feet in place so you can see what I mean, that I don't want your feet to move, and you have, more of a luxury of really, truly teaching and making sure they understand what you're saying. We're in a group class, we got to move, right? We got to keep everybody moving. So I love with helping with coming up with concise power phrase, words that are fast, and so you're not wasting time in between those phrases.
No, and obviously you're a master trainer, been doing that a long time, so you're good at that. But aren't you jumping into something now that maybe you can help instructors with that?
Yes. So one of the things is the power phrases, and then another one is like visual cues, right? And helping them understand, where to look, or the blueberry and the marble, and, images that I talked about earlier. But yeah, so I'm super excited. I am doing a mentoring workshop for instructors where you can get CECs, so you can get continuing education credits through the national, the governing body over Pilates in PCP. I'm so excited. They actually started following me on social media. So
yay!
I've been geeking out about that all weekend. Super excited.
That's great.
So if you need CECs, I would love to help you. If you need help with mentoring or coaching or cueing, I talk a lot about in the mentoring program about cueing in general, how to put a class together, how to put a private session together, what the spinal movements are, what the best ways to teach the spinal movements and the best cues for those. And I'm excited because these are all things that I've struggled with in the past and sometimes still do.
Oh yeah. Well, I think, I think every body that is in front of you is different. So you're going to have a challenge with everyone, but I think it's really great. And of course, CECs are for those of us who are nationally or internationally certified, but that doesn't mean you need to have or need CECs to take your mentoring, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Exactly. So, and I think, you can do it just to improve your teaching skills. Just if you're interested in becoming an instructor, you could do it just as a segue of finding out.
I'm interested in learning everything I can, so I'm excited for the launch because I'm interested in
I'm really excited. It's cool. And this is like my favorite part of my career is helping people with finding their voice when they're teaching and learning how to teach to the body in front of them or the body is in front of them. And so I'm excited. I'm happy to share my knowledge. And it's been, hard for me to put myself out there. So
I know, but I keep encouraging you. I'm a Stacey cheerleader.
Thank you. And so is Sage.
Yes, Sage is becoming a regular part of our show, aren't you, Sage? Speaking of which, I think that we probably should sign off for today and we'll come back again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for tuning in. For more information, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Pilates is the Answer and on the web at pilatesistheanswer.com.
Feel free to message us with questions for which you are searching the answer. We would love for you to follow our podcast, leave a kind review, and lots of stars.